My ancestral home. My family have lived at Markeden House for generations, for its entire history in fact. It was built in 1706 by Sir Henry Markeden, who lived here only a year before his death. His eldest son Hubert Markeden inherited and lived here with his wife and children for nearly 40 years. Every subsequent generation has learnt the history, the significance of the place. Every member of family remains here long after their death. They still reside in the brick walls, the lofty rafters, up the chimneys and under the floorboards. They're everywhere. They hear every word spoken within, every whispered secret, every sordid affair. They know everything there is to know about this place, and we, the living, are but humble students to this fountain of knowledge. A humble router sits on a tall three-legged table in the draughty corner. Its flickering lights and sleek modern design are perilously out of place under the portrait of Charles Markeden Smythe, 1841 to 1897. His stern countenance stares ever past the device, as if too disgusted to look at it directly. The lino-paved bathroom on the second floor, with its electric shower and LED lighting, sits awkwardly between the creaking wooden floors and portrait-lined walls of the adjoining rooms. Hugo Markeden Wallace, 1901 to 1956, looks bemusedly at anyone coming out of it, from his lofty position on the opposite wall, as if to say, "Oh, the luxurious lives led by the youth of today." In my room, Lady Margaret Markeden, 1775 to 1868, occupies a central position before my bed. I wish her good night every time I plug my phone in and switch off the light. She is stoic in her silence. As a child, she would always seem to disapprove of my wild games and plastic toys. But she must now be appalled at what I've become. The clothes I wear, my makeup and dyed hair, the music I play when no one's home. Certainly things have gone markedly downhill since grandfather died. I was 13, and to say his passing was a relief would be unfair, but I was at least pleased to no longer be living under his watchful eyes and draconian laws. There's respect, and then there's reverence. He was convinced that the house, in a very literal sense, contained the spirits of all of our ancestors, every single one. When I was very young, he'd tell me the story of Lillian Markeden, 1794 to 1869, who married a captain of the Royal Navy and went off on adventures and explorations with him in his ship, the Queen Mary. It was on a Caribbean island. Her husband had died, leaving her in charge of sailing the ship home to England, with only her young son, Albert, 1814 to 1821, in tow. She lived in the bedroom at the end of the top floor corridor. As a child, I really believed she was there, not to be disturbed. Sometimes I'd go up there on my own, braving the dust and the gloom, and put my ear to the door, in the hope of hearing her inside. One time I peeked through the keyhole and saw what I thought to be the corner of her dress. I watched it fascinated for several minutes, waiting for her to move. Of course, I know now it was only a curtain, and when I finally went into that room for the first time, I found it very different to how I'd imagined it. There are some fouler corners of our family history that our grandfather chose to omit, even when I was older. Joseph Markeden Smythe, 1845 to 1903, had been a philanderer and an alcoholic, whose wife and baby had died in childbirth. Furthermore, his gambling habits had nearly bankrupted the family estate, and he'd died in a sanatorium of what was probably syphilis. I don't know where in the house grandfather believed he lived. I'm glad he never said. Every Christmas we'd place red candles in the tree. They had to be red. It was what our family had always done for generations, probably going back to Hugo, who'd been a big celebrator of Christmas, so they say. When I was a bit older, grandfather became increasingly disapproving of me. He resisted any attempt to modernise the house in any way, shape or form. Everything had to be kept just how it was, how it had always been. My parents weren't even allowed to replace the peeling and tattered wallpaper with an exact replica. Everything had to remain. What had been small eccentricities slowly started becoming problems and eventually doctrine. He always raised a glass to Sir Henry before every meal. I would do it at school as well, thinking that everybody thanked Sir Henry before every meal. The teachers thought there was something wrong with me and contacted my parents, who had to explain that you only had to do that at home. Later, he thanked Sir Henry every time he left the building, and if we'd have a meal in another room of the house, he'd also thank every family member who'd added a French window or a larger mantelpiece, or who'd purchased the table that we were sat around, or who simply lived in that particular room. Sometimes the list would extend to 10 or 12 people. We'd all have to raise our glasses as well, and if we'd ever forgotten somebody, we'd have to stop and toast them as well. It became increasingly obsessive as time went on. He'd dust the picture frames every day, then twice, then 3 times a day. He'd insist on silence in certain rooms, the ones occupied by the ancestors he most respected. He'd make us dress up in our best clothes for evening meals, and would make visitors enter by the rear door and sleep in the servants' quarters. His health began to decline when I was about 11. He'd be bedridden for days on end and could be heard conversing with the spirit of Lady Margaret's younger sister, Cecil, 1778 to 1862, whose room his used to be. I once stood outside and listened to the delirious streams of facts and figures interspersed with his own fantasies about people behind the dates and portraits. On one occasion, he was found navigating the corridors in the dead of night, calling out for the late Catherine Wallis, 1905 to 1968, who he'd known as a young man. I suppose she'd been something of a link between the old and the new, the history and the present. He wanted to warn her about Eliza, her daughter who died in a car crash in 1933. "Don't let her get into the car! Don't let her get into the car!" It was awful. They tried to put him in a home after that, but he refused to leave the house. After he died, my parents found boxes of letters he'd written to various characters, imagining himself to be one of their contemporaries, and flattering them, like a fan writing to a famous actor. It was only a few weeks before Christmas, and we decorated the tree with red candles in his memory, and said thank you to Sir Henry at dinner. It felt wrong without it. In fact, we never stopped. Some nights I go up to Lillian's room and remember the old stories with fondness. Her portrait takes pride of place above the mantelpiece, a proud and defiant expression on her face that seems to clash with her flowing white dress, her ornate jewellery, and immaculately presented hair. I look into her eyes and can almost hear her words. I can imagine her on the deck of the Queen Mary, with young Albert by her side, oblivious of what was to become of them both. If somebody could look back at me here, with the benefit of hindsight, how would they see me in the context of my own story? All stories are tragic when left to play beyond their natural boundaries. "Thank you, Lillian," I whisper as I leave the room. "And thank you, Sir Henry."